We're going to go over the three dubs of Oklahoma. They're Will, Wiley, and Woody. They're Will Rogers, Wiley Post, and Woody Guthrie. They were all um, alive about the same time. Woody's a little bit younger than the other two, um, but they're all major impacts. They're all Oklahomans, and we're going to run over each one of them. The first one we're going to talk about is Will Rogers. Will Rogers, his grandfather actually signed the Treaty of New Echota, which removed the Indians, the Cherokee Indians, in the 1830s. His dad was actually a chief and a major contributor to the Cherokee Nation and Indian Territory, and so he's, you can tell he's Cherokee, and grew up in Oologah, Oklahoma, where he was born. And you can go see his birthplace there. It's a big old white house that has a lot of stuff in it that from him. But Will Rogers, growing up on a farm, learned how to trick rope. And like one of my, I can't find a good video of it without showing you a huge video, but there's one scene where he has three ropes going, and a rider is riding by him on a horse, and he throws three ropes at this rider, and by the time that the ropes are tightened, he's got one rope over the rider's shoulders, one over the head of the horse, and one underneath the hoofs of the horse, and he's pulled them all and stopped them. And we're talking about someone that's a major trick roper. And so as a young age, he's known as the Cherokee Kid, and he went to South Africa with a Wild West show. And from there, people in Africa and Europe learned his name. And that got him a part in vaudeville, which is in New York City, which is today we know it as Broadway, and was in a bunch of different shows up there, which eventually got him parts into silent films. In a roundabout way, he was actually somewhat of a failure in silent films. Yes, the trick roping and his comical face and antics were a hit, but in the big picture, he really wasn't famous then. But what happens to movies eventually is they begin to talk, or what they call talkies. And when Will Rogers spoke, that made him one of the top actors in Hollywood, because his oaky draw and his jokes and his antics put it all together, and people loved Will Rogers. He's known as a humorist. He was a newspaper guy. There is a lot of people that if you ask about Will Rogers running for president, they would say that he was thinking about it. And we're going to find out what happens to him, but there is a good chance that if Will Rogers would have run for president, he would have won. He was that popular, and people loved him. If you look at the pictures of him, even when he's young, on up into times when he was working in the movies, his antics alone and his mannerisms, he's one of those guys you want to meet. He is constantly somebody that he's chewing gum, you know, roasting somebody, playing tricks on them. He was just a guy that just enjoyed life. And if you watch him when he's in his moments, you just wanted to meet the man. He's a really, really fun guy to follow. His quotes are well known. His most famous quote was, "I never met a man I didn't like." What did that mean? It meant that when he met somebody and he walked away, he goes, "Man, I like that guy," or "I like that girl," or He always liked whoever he was talking to. And so if you ever go over to Washington, D.C. at the state nation's capital, they have a big room called the Hall of Famous Americans, and there's a big statue of him, and that's the quote on it. It says, "I've never met a man I didn't like." But here you go. This is Will Rogers, and this is actually an advertisement, but you're going to get a gist of what he is.
Hello, folks. I've looked out at you from the movie screen and the stage, but I never got a chance to talk to you at home before.
It wasn't the working class that brought this condition on at all. It was the big boys themselves who thought that this we're going through was going to last forever.
Loan sharks and interest hounds. I have addressed every form of organized graft in the United States, excepting Congress.
Here we are in a country with more wheat, more corn, money in the bank, more cotton, more everything in the world. There's not a product that you can name that we haven't got more of it than any country ever had on the face of the earth. And yet we've got people starving. We'll hold the distinction of being the only nation in the history of the world that went to the poorhouse in an automobile. The potter's field are lined with granaries full of grain. Now, if there ain't something cockeyed in an arrangement like that, then this microphone here in front of me is, well, it's a cuspidor, that's all.
How did a plain-spoken, rope-twirling Cherokee become such an influential voice? Hello, I'm Bill Curtis. Will Rogers was a worldwide phenomenon by the late 1920s. And when talked, everybody listened.
One thing he was excellent at as a political commentator was politics. He was very shrewd, savvy, so he really had the number of all the congressmen, high office holders, even the presidents in Washington.
The best Democrat we ever had in the White House, anyhow. He was just the man we needed. He didn't do nothing, but that's what we wanted done.
He was so popular. I think he was probably, in his time, the most widely recognized public figure of politics in the United States. He was great.
Prohibition, we hear a lot about that. Well, that's nothing to compare to your neighbor's children that are hungry. It's food, it ain't drink that we're worried about today.
That's what he sit here and talk about Will Rogers. He will never, ever be forgotten.
I thank you. Good night.
Join me on RSU Public Television for a special look back at the
So you he was an advertisement, but you could see a little bit of um, his personality. You could see him try to roast Coolidge. Coolidge, they called him the Sphinx because he had a straight face, and a lot of people said that when Will Rogers roasted him, that the Sphinx broke a few times to smile because he got him. But anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about Wiley Post. Wiley Hardeman Post was born in Texas, but I don't know, it was about a year or when he was 2, he moved to Maysville, Oklahoma. And Wiley Post was actually a horrible student. He didn't want to stay in school. He didn't want to go to school. Um, his parents finally gave up to him at 6th grade. He dropped out of school. He started working in the oil field. He got stuck in prison. You want to talk about a list of things of if there was somebody that you shouldn't have any success stories, Wiley Post, probably before he was 20 years old, was one of those guys that you thought would not live very long. And when he finally got a job in the oil field, somebody put some trust into him and taught him how to fly an airplane. And so this is where he took up aviation and just started becoming one of the best pilots around. He lost his eye later on in his life. You'll see pictures of him without the patch. But they used to put these hot pins in coals and get them all red. and then they'd stick them in the steel, and then they would pound them in, and then pour cold water on it so it would expand. And when they put the hot pin in the hole and hit it, a little piece of the metal sparked out and landed in his eye and caused an infection that would have lost both eyes if they didn't remove the one eye. And so that's why he had one eye. But he took up aviation, and he's literally the first man to fly solo around the world. He actually flew solo twice. The first time he did it with a navigator, and the second time he did it alone. He developed the high pressurized suit, which many of the patents were used still today with our astronauts. And he developed all kinds of altitude and airspeed records. You name it. The guy who basically wrote the way that you fly is Wiley Post. This is the famous Winnie Mae. It's on display at the Smithsonian. Um, there are lots of books and reports out there, even some videos that talk about how he wrecked the Winnie Mae. And that's false. He never did. And we'll talk about that later. But if you look behind the wheel, you can barely see it. There's the list of the towns he went around on the 2 times he went around the Earth. And then on the far back fin, you can see the Winnie Mae, and you can see the 3 records that he broke in that airplane. And here he is without the eye patch when he had both eyes. And this was after his first time around the world. And you can see the list of it right behind the wheel, and so on. Here's a little video about Wiley Post.
Wiley Hardeman Post is remembered today for his astounding aeronautical achievements. He was the first pilot to fly solo around the world. He was honored with a ticker tape parade in New York City. He was a most unlikely candidate for fame.
It was a hard knock life for Wiley Post. He didn't like school. He dropped out of school early in the 6th grade. Imagine that. By the time he was 18, he had been arrested for stealing cars. He was sentenced to do 10 years at the reformatory at Granite. He only served about a year of that 10-year prison sentence. The prison doctors diagnosed him as suffering from what was then called chronic melancholy. Today, we know that as chronic depression.
Perhaps it was the hard knock life that fueled his drive and determination. Post actually invented the pressure suit that allowed him to fly at high altitudes in his beloved Winnie Mae. Modern astronauts still wear suits based on Post's design. The Oklahoma History Center has a display of amazing examples of his engineering skills, things that we take for granted today, like the altimeter. He invented things because he needed them.
The tools that he invented were the standard tools for aerial navigation until recent years with the advent of GPS. And many small planes still use those tools with their maps, with their charts, in order to navigate from point A to point B.
Modern aviation can also thank Post for the autopilot and what we know about the jet stream. Today, it might be tough for a guy who lost an eye in an oil field accident to even be licensed to fly. But by the time he died with Will Rogers in an Alaskan plane crash in 1935, Wiley Post had proven that adversity could not defeat desire and ingenuity.
He was recognized then, before his death, and is still recognized today as one of the foremost aeronautical engineers in the history of aviation. He was a 6th grade dropout. He was an ex-con. He had no depth perception because he only had one eye, and he suffered from chronic depression. And he overcame all of those things to accomplish all of the things that he did.
One of his favorite airports is no longer an airport, but if you go downtown and you see the Ferris wheel that's lit up at night, that is what's called the Midtown or Downtown Airfield, and he used to fly in that a lot. And when people learned that he was flying into town, he would fly in to a huge crowd of people waiting to see him. In 1935, one of the things that Wiley Post always asked, because a lot of people don't know about Will Rogers, was that he was a pilot himself. And Wiley had asked him multiple times to go on trips with him. And one time, Will Rogers bit and said, "Let's do it." And Wiley Post was going to show, actually map out a mail route that went over Alaska, over the Arctic Ocean, and into Europe. And he put together a airplane, not the Winnie Mae, but he put together another airplane called what he called the Lockheed Vega. And the problem with the Lockheed Vega is that his pontoons on the airplane were way too heavy. So as they flew, it took a strain to the engine. And eventually, as they made it all the way across Alaska, the engine was actually not running properly, that they were actually in a dive the whole time they were flying, and none of the instruments on the airplane were actually showing that they were. So they actually rode in the ground and didn't even know it. It killed them both in Point Barrow, Alaska, on the very far north. Like if you look up Point Barrow, Alaska, you can't go any further without ending up in the Arctic Ocean. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize too, Will Rogers was nationally known. Wiley Post was worldly known. So this is a big deal. And a lot of people have asked me why are our two major airports in Oklahoma City named after two guys killed in the same plane crash. It's because they're literally two of our most famous sons. That's why. So that's what happened to both of them in 1935. This is the airplane. That's the Lockheed Vega that he put together. And this is some of the last pictures that they have of them. One of the cool things up in Claremore, there's a huge museum with Will Rogers. They actually have the suit Will Rogers was wearing and his luggage and everything that he had in the airplane. And they've taken his coat that he was wearing and they've put it out, laid it out, and they've emptied his pockets. And you want to talk about just leaving a legacy about what that man was about. In his pockets were little gadgets of toys, jacks, those little things that you throw the ball up in the air and try to put it in the cup, stuff like that, and pictures of his family. And, you know, it's kind of, wow, good job, Will. He loved to toy around. He had a mind of a child, and he loved his family. And it just shows right there in his pockets, in the coat that he wore when he passed away. This is the place where they were up in Point Barrow, Alaska. These are the two monuments where the airplane crash was. This is the actual plane crash. And you can see the pontoons right there are the reason why.
Shortly after selling the Winnie Mae to the Smithsonian, Wiley Post bought two wrecked Lockheeds and put them together into one airworthy plane. The hybrid was known as the Orion Explorer. Will Rogers and Wiley Post took the Orion Explorer up to Alaska on the first leg of a vacation trip in the summer of 1935. Fitted with pontoons of improper size, their plane proved dangerous to land. While taking off from a lagoon near Point Barrow, Alaska on August 15th, the Orion Explorer's engine quit. The aircraft dove straight into the shallow water, killing both Post and Rogers on impact. One of America's best-loved aviators, along with one of its best-loved writers, had come to a tragic end.
So there you go. That's what happened to Will Rogers and Wiley Post. The last W is a little controversial. His name was Woody Guthrie. He was born and raised in Okemah, Oklahoma. And he wrote songs about the Depression. He traveled when he was 19 years old. He left Okemah and he traveled all over the country, singing songs about what people were going through. One thing you'll realize the older you get, songs will bring back memories of the past. And songs mean a lot to you. If you listen to a song, a lot of times it brings back the memories or the feelings or whatever you had when you were listening to it back in the day. And so this is what makes Woody Guthrie way more famous than you would imagine. People related to his songs. So when he's sitting there singing around the Dust Bowl or the Great Depression or whatever people were going through, they related to him. One of the things, for the longest time, Okemah would not recognize him from being from Okima. They called him a communist. And only lately have they really recognized him as being there. And there's a big festival that goes on every July called the Woody Guthrie Festival. It's a week long. Um, it's kind of expensive to park, but the concert's free. Um, but he's known as the father of folk music, and born and raised in Okima. You can go see the House Foundation where he grew up. Um, used to be able to see a place in the cement downtown. They took it out. I need to figure out where they put it, where he signed it. But Woody Guthrie. His most famous song, of course, is "This Land Is Your Land." Probably you learned that in elementary school. And so here's about Woody Guthrie.
Unquestionably, the most enduring musical figure to emerge from the Dust Bowl era was a man named Woody Guthrie. Why was Woody so popular? What kind of songs did he sing? Woody Guthrie was born in Okima, Oklahoma in 1912. His father was the first county clerk in Okfuskee County. By the standards of the day, his family was an average, middle-class family. At the age of 6, Woody's sister died tragically in a kitchen accident. Not long after, his mother was stricken with Huntington's disease. Doctors of the time were unfamiliar with the disease, and as a result, she was placed in a mental institution. When Woody was 19, he moved to Pampa, Texas, and started performing with a band known as the Corncob Trio. However, in 1935, he packed up his belongings and headed west with the rest of the Okies. Along the way, he rode in boxcars and jalopies, going from Oklahoma to Kansas, Colorado, and California. During his journeys, he lived amongst the migrant workers, singing to them and about them. He sang to the people who were always too hot, too cold, too hungry, or too poor. He sang old hymns and folk songs, which comforted the migrants and reminded them of home and of simpler times. He also wrote his own music. Many of the songs he wrote were hard-hitting social commentaries about what he saw going on around him, the hardships people were facing, the unemployment, the hunger, and the diseases which ravaged them. As time progressed, the themes in his songs continued to become increasingly politicized. Much of his music advocated the sharing of wealth. He eventually became famous as a voice for the working class and a champion of worker rights. Many criticized his songs for these themes, and some even accused him of being a communist. Woody genuinely believed in the ideals he sang about. He didn't believe in the personal ownership of his music. He always said, "These songs didn't cost me anything to write, so you can have them if you want them." He also gave much of the money he made to those who needed it. Throughout his years living in California amongst the migrant workers, he held many different jobs. He painted signs, picked fruit, and washed dishes. He hosted a weekly radio show out of Los Angeles where he was billed as Oklahoma Woody. He even wrote a weekly newspaper column called Woody Says. In 1940, Woody left California and traveled to New York City. It was there that he wrote his most famous song, "This Land Is Your Land," as a protest song. It was also in New York where he finally recorded many of the songs he had been singing for years. RCA made a collection of Woody Guthrie music known as Dust Bowl Ballads. Unfortunately for Woody, he began exhibiting some of the early symptoms of Huntington's disease, the same illness which had inflicted his mother. By the early 1950s, his condition was so bad that he was no longer able to perform, and he spent the final years of his life in and out of the hospital. He died in 1967 at the age of 55. Woody Guthrie changed the world of American music forever. He was one of the first extremely influential singer-songwriters in American history. He inspired countless other songwriters who followed him, and continues to do so today.